Okay, I'm recording and I'll have a brief presentation in a minute, but I do want to stop long enough to see if any of you have specific questions to date that you have for me before I do the presentation on the material for our final assignment. Anything bugging you guys? Anything that
I got a question.
Sure, Victor, go ahead.
I don't want you never to not answer a question, so I got one always. But I missed the assignment on Monday because I turned in the paper, the paper on Tuesday, and I didn't know that. I thought the paper that was due on Monday, you say give us a Tuesday to turn it in, but I didn't know that was also that required reading there either. So are you allowing us to make that up, or
Yes.
if okay?
Yeah, and that is, I mean, I hope you've heard Palmer's really almost one way to think about it is a kind of devotional resource for this class. Since we don't meet regularly and we don't have an opening time of reading and reflection and devotion, Palmer serves as that kind of a resource for the class. So it was never intended to be content to master, but just content to dwell with. So Victor, go ahead and turn it in. Worst case scenario might be a point or two off, but nothing more than that. So, and if you've noticed, I really just give you permission to relate with Palmer. He has been formative in my life. Actually, had opportunity to break bread with him and hear him present. So I just find his work more as a resource to our class than kind of a requirement to show mastery over. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, if it's okay, one thing, if you have other questions, I know Natalie's got to leave. We have a district assembly in Church of the Nazarene going on this week, which has pulled Ashley away and will pull Natalie. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the final project and then answer any of the questions you might have. Okay. Will that work for everybody? All right. Well, to do that, I'm going to share my screen, and you can still, if you want, instead of just see me alone, and I don't know how this works. This is Victor and Dusty. You might just be stuck with my face only. That's the downside of this arrangement. But you can, if you're on a website, you normally can see each other alongside the screen. And let's see, let's see what I shared. Let me make sure I shared the right thing. Nope, I didn't. There we go. So all I'm going to do, okay, you should see now basically just our website for congregational education formation. And what I wanted to talk about is quite literally the last paper that's due the last day of the semester. And I recognize 7 weeks, even with a break, which happened to be earlier in the quote semester, that 7 weeks doesn't hardly give you time to breathe. So I wanted you to be thinking about this paper now, rather than, some of you've done courses where you would kind of get done with the content, maybe even have a week to kind of do research and writing, and then turn the paper in during exam week. And it just does not work that way in the NNU program. Some of you that are pros who've been at this for a while know that pretty well, but think about Shauna and Natalie, this is one of those things where, this program is sort of like April the 15th and taxes. So it just kind of comes and it's there and you got to get past it. So the assignment reads, basically that evaluate a current educational ministry in your local church, starting with analysis from Foster's book and other writings in the course, and then follow with a mission statement, objectives, and comprehensive strategy that responds to the context, right? The strategy for possible changes and implementation for future ministry based on course knowledge. This would include the congregation's historical approach to educational ministry, its present strengths and weaknesses, age level considerations, comprehensive organization, and practical strategies for change. And you go, wait, I need a whole semester to do that. right? I mean, particularly the way it's written. It's like, oh, and by the way, just analyze an entire congregation, know everything about it, every nuance of all the intricacies of all of its ministries, including its history, come up with a mission statement, goals, and a strategy for all of that. Simple, right? Okay, take a deep breath. Okay, Shauna's like, it's too late to drop. So what am I going to do? Take a deep breath. Let me remind us, some of these pieces we've already sort of done. So one thing I want you to do when it comes to that is I do want to think about a local church. You can think about an alternative ministry if it's broad enough that that it fits where you can do some analysis, I guess is the best way to say it, alongside the strategies. So, and it can sometimes be a ministry. So Natalie, I know you work with children, and I think probably family life, if memory serves me. Am I correct on that? So you could say that's where I'm going to spend most of my time, where Victor may be thinking about the church as a whole. Dusty, I know you've been a chaplain, so one of the things even to think about is more work within a university setting as a whole. Shauna, prison ministry, I'm not sure if it fits neatly, but I would work with you if that's your primary area of ministry, thinking about the various aspects of the whole of how prison ministry works, not just your parachute in each week, but what kind of resources might be there. But Shauna, you could also just pick your church and go that route if you prefer. And if there's an area that you're really focused in of ministry in that church, start with that location instead of prison. Does that make sense? Okay, and Ashley will have the same thing. I know she works at NNU, but I also know she's active at Napa College, so she could actually adopt Napa College as her strategy. First thing is really to kind of go back to the first book we read, and some of you saw this book in green and a green cover instead of gold. But if you remember, the whole goal of Foster's book, outside of talking about the flaws, is he talked about events that form and transform, building community, meaning making, and nurturing hope. And he had these four big kind of categories. And what he was saying is, where is it that the church, what kind of events happen at the church that are eventful? If you remember, even had categories like things that are more seasonal versus things that really sort of define the church in and through their worship. Like those of you who have a liturgical calendar, a lot of times, since we've just come out of Easter, do we think of Easter as more of a pandemic event, where Mother's Day might be more of a seasonal event? Now, some churches that might flip. Some of you been in those churches. I have, but at least it's one way to think about it. And then where do people try to make sense of their lives and understanding of what God's will is for their life and how God communicates that through Scripture? It's kind of meaning making. Where is it that people come together and find community in a COVID age? That's an interesting question. But it really is that kind of building and that nurturing hope for him. Foster is saying, where is it the church lives out God's hope in the world? And you might think about that as service or compassionate ministries, those ways in which we, as we live together, we actually live out a hopeful vision. Or one way to think about it right now is even what resurrection looks like being lived out in the world around us. Now, Dusty, in some ways, they'd be saying, we're in the university life and the spiritual life of the university. Are there certain things that define it eventfully? Are there certain places where meaning is really pursued? But are there also places where students find community together? And then how is it that students are encouraged to live outward instead of just focusing inward? And so you could do that with a church in mind, or you could do that with some other institution. Sean, again, don't know if you have access to a prison to even think that way. So a local congregation might be easier. You should have done some of this. I mean, when you were reading and thinking, so I'm not asking you to do a lot more. If you get sort of worried about that, after the Nurturing Hope chapter, he has a guide to he calls it re-envisioning local church education. And he just kind of gives you, starting on page 140, kind of exercises to sort of make sense of that. And so all you're doing is you don't have to slavishly follow that. It's just if you're wrestling, but you're just kind of wandering around and saying, how is it that the church or the organization as a whole educates and forms people? And then, and I would say this for Natalie, for instance, and how does children's ministry and family life ministry fit within that? Okay. And that should be a portion of the paper. It doesn't have to be exhaustive, but it sets a context so that you're engaged in ministry. Now, all that language about mission statement, objectives is basically so in light of what you've been reading, in light of just recently your own theology and philosophy of education formation, how would you help to rally that church to become a little more faithful in the way it does education and formation going forward? So your church may already have a mission statement, universities do, but what I'm saying is in light of what you want to see do better, could there be a kind of mission statement or sort of a principle or a kind of guide, if you will, to say, in order to make this church more faithful in education formation, we need to live into this mission or this vision, this idea. And again, going back to Natalie, and if that works primarily with children in mind or families in mind, you just name that from that standpoint. But all you're trying to do is help the church think about being more faithful. I'm not saying a church is faithless. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here, but this is not going in and tearing up a congregation. It's already doing things well. It's just saying, how do we make the other certain places better than what they are now? And that is very organic to giving congregations. There are some churches, because of their size, their strength, their emphasis, it might mean that there's only 2 or 3 areas that you need to inspire them to become more faithful in what they do. And it really isn't so much a bad to good as it is a good to better kind of mindset from that standpoint. Are there certain things, and can you set maybe a couple of goals that could help a church or, again, a ministry like chaplaincy ministry at the university say, these are the ways in which we can make that, we need to try to make that happen. So everybody with me so far? So kind of a sense of the whole of and you write that up, kind of how things are going when education formation. Then is there a kind of common mission or vision that could help articulate how to improve what's happening? And can you set a couple of goals to say, how do we know we'll be going that direction? What do we need to do to get there? And then that comprehensive strategy is really more taking what already the church is doing and thinking about employing that in such a way that it builds and becomes better at what it does in education and formation. That might be places where you spend almost as much time already sort of listing some of the things the church does. Does it have a Sunday school or a small group ministry? Does it have specific ministries with children in mind? Does it already have a built-in strategy within the office of chaplaincy at the university? And all you're doing there is thinking about making sure you name the elements that are happening. And then you ask yourself, how could they either A, be improved, or could something B, be supplemented and added that could help move this church or this ministry move forward in light of this vision and these goals we've set? And at that point, you're suggesting either places for improvement or maybe sometimes additions for the sake of change. Okay. And by the time you've written that up, you will be well into you should be done between 15,000, 2,000 words. I mean, one way to think of it is 250 words to a page. So we're talking 6 to 8 pages. This is not a massively large paper, but I'd say take at least a page or so to describe the setting, to kind of wander in and through those elements. Maybe could be almost up to 2 pages. Take time to then name your vision and anchor it in your own philosophy and theology. So give it some legs, some rationale, biblical rationale or theological rationale. For me, yes, the Sunday school answer is means of grace, but that's because then I could cite that for 755 days if I needed to. But for you, what is the the metaphor that describes that vision or mission, and then how do you anchor that in scripture or theology? You've already written a paper just recently on that, so it would just be attaching to that. And then the last piece is just thinking strategically on how then you would help that congregation move. Does it mean you need to improve the leadership? Does it mean you need to add an element, maybe even at the most a program? Well, if you do, what would it look like? What kind of curriculum? But it's really more if you were sitting down with your leadership and describing how that might go forward from that standpoint. Okay. And you will have completed the assignment, so to speak, that way. Victor, I should say one thing I meant to say is, and nurturing hope for Foster is not bad, but actually advocacy and some of the reading that we did from Lament Advocacy, for instance, in your context, and I would actually say in all churches' context these days, that might be a place where that becomes important, both in what the church is already doing, but also going forward. So to some degree, it may be that Ann Streety Wimberly is a stronger conversation partner in the way you're describing what your church is doing and where it would go with its education and formation, as a Chuck Foster would be in making that happen. So feel free to bring resources in the conversation as you need them. Foster's just simple because we've already read it and it's there, and it's a fairly easy way to kind of get into the local church analysis. But you're not limited to that. As a matter of fact, if been reading the book Mark Maddox and I did, instead of his big four, we use three: formation, discernment, and transformation is the way we wander around inside communities of faith to think about what discipleship looks like. And it's the same kind of set of questions. It just looks differently from our standpoint as opposed to Foster. So if that one actually works better for you than Foster, you can use that, just name that up front. So you use one model sort of consistently at the beginning. Okay. One thing I will go ahead and say, let me just say one thing we used to do in a class like this, we don't do anymore, is we would spend probably 3 weeks on methodologies. In other words, how to do Christian education. And a lot of times I used to include a book like this one by Delia Halverson, and I'll back up, called Nuts and Bolts of Christian Education. And we used to call these the big books. So they're large. They got lots of chapters in them that are real short. This one has like 8 chapters, double column kind of thing. And the reason we would use something like this is because the back half of the book is nothing but appendices that have all kinds of worksheets in them. And for someone coming out of an undergraduate program who maybe has never worked in a church or a congregation and has never done any kind of evaluation, has never thought about a budget for Christian education, for instance, who has to find themselves doing teacher training workshops, and they need certain kinds of guidelines on sort of the different aspects and characteristics of children and youth. So they could literally photocopy sections of this book and hand them out in teacher training sessions. These books were gold. And I'll be the first to say they're not bad to have on your bookshelf every once in a while when you're stuck and you need an idea starter. But at graduate education, most of us are already working in ministry. And I'm a big believer starting where you are instead of trying to create an abstract vision of education and formation that would work, quote, in any church, because that just means it probably would never work in any one church at all. We would always be adapting that. So a lot of the reading for the next week, which comes out of my book with Mark and Everest's book, are really, they're full chapters, but they're really kind of comprehensive treatments of different approaches to education and formation, different strategies for ministry, certain leadership principles. And it's a lot of material in the last week, but I expect you to survey that. Look for things that catch your attention. There is a chapter on family ministry. You can go, well, I'm not going to spend time with all four of the age level. I'll spend time reading about family ministry in the book. There are chapters on legal considerations, or there's a chapter on supervision. So there you are really saying, in light of the church I'm in the context or ministry setting I'm in, what out of this reading might be most helpful in creating the strategy? And rather than going in, because you're all in the different locations, running over to a library and trying to check out 4 books on administration in the local church, we provide you enough material just to get you thinking. And there may come an idea in the reading next week. You go, ooh, yeah, I think that would really help in my congregation. If you use that in the strategy, just cite where it comes from. But next week is really resource time. And all those chapters are really designed more to resource you and where you are than me dictating what you ought to do. And I really want you to hear that. Mark and I, particularly in our book, we have a lot of passion. Probably the biggest passion we have is actually on child safety. So you're going to get a long introduction to that one in there. That's been probably one of the biggest failures in the church that I can name, is our tendency to not work to our hardest for the sake of the defenseless in our congregations. And so you'll see a heavy dose of that in our text. But if your church already has a really strong safety policy, that's not going to be the concern. It'll be some other place that you'll think about doing that ministry and that intervention. Okay. Well, that's all I've got to say about that. Starting to feel like a Forrest Gump moment coming. But I did wonder if you have any questions about that final paper, or if this at least helps to settle you. As you read the instructions on that, it can sound daunting. And yes, it could be a really super big project, but it's not intended to be that. Always look at the length of that. And we do ask you to include 2 to 3 bibliographic references, but that includes things like Foster. It's nothing new. It's really all the things you've been reading and working with as the semester is coming along. So it's not a research paper. It's just refer when you're actually using that material to help us know that help me know that you're doing that. Okay. Questions, anyone? Dusty?
Just out of curiosity, I guess, I'm curious in that child safety component there, do you feel like that has been a unique challenge in the Nazarene church as opposed to others, or not?
I think it's a challenge across the board. I could go into a lengthy lecture, but I'll just say it this way. Churches are built to be public and open and welcoming, as opposed to other institutions, including education, schools, that actually can be quite enclosed. And I mean, my wife works in an elementary school now, and when you go into that building, there's only one place you can go, and that's to the office. And you have to check in, and a lot of times they have whole sets of controls. But churches are built to be open, to invite people in. And so it makes us very susceptible to predators in the way we are wired to be an open, welcoming community. And actually what I find fascinating is at times we can be very exclusive of certain people. But actually, this is one place where pedophiles, by coming in and merely not just disclosing, can look all too normal, and we become very trusting from that standpoint. So I don't think it's that the church is callous. I just think it's one place where we have to swim upstream to our natural proclivity to make access to what we do as public and open as possible. And then children, as a result of that, often bear the brunt in our congregations. And so, and no church intentionally brings anyone in that would harm children. I mean, but they just aren't wired to think about the potential dangers in the same way as other institutions are wired to do that. So I hope you hear that. Church Nazarene historically did have a problem. There's a very long backstory, but having worked in the denomination, actually having helped at one point to start a sort of a drumbeat around this when I was teaching at Trevecca more than 25 years ago, having been on the ground floor of the creation of a child safety policy at one point that the denomination chose not to implement. Then to watch the denomination about 3 years later go through a lawsuit in one of the churches that ultimately became a lawsuit against the entire denomination. And the plaintiff won. And the church was mandated to create a child safety, a national child safety policy. And so there is one out there. It's called NAS Safe, and it's part of the Ministry Safe network. That's an organization, but the church blew it. There's no other way to say it. And I do know this. I actually up until May 2nd, then it'll change. I've been in charge of clergy education for now 20 years in the United States and Canada, guiding that process. I'm not the sheriff over clergy education, but I've guided that process. And we are constantly stunned at churches who fail when it comes to child safety policy. And we've actually included it as part of clergy education. That's why I'm talking about it even here. And I even know, truthfully, that our general secretary, who did oversee the oversight of our congregations, was just flabbergasted. All this material was put into place, and yet still churches didn't take it as seriously as possible, often because perpetrators are people that we know. And that's very difficult from that standpoint to respond to. So you'll see in the reading, I have a little methodology called Take 5, which is intentional to jumpstart congregations, to make them just synthesize to this need. And that simple strategy is just to encourage them to take it seriously. But what I tend to find is that this is one place where gravity is pretty powerful. Churches get very invested in it. They do a good job for a period of time. And because nothing happens, they begin to lose the vigilance. And then unfortunately, it takes an incident, hopefully not in their church, but somewhere near them, what I call a near miss. And all of a sudden it ramps up the interest again. But I do believe it's just that openness that churches have had, particularly in the United States, to want to be welcoming and bringing people in, and always being fearful of excluding through this process. And that's been one of the real struggles that the church has had. So go ahead.
Can I say something?
Yes.
You're the Nazarene's not the only church, like you said, that has that problem. I know our church, the AME Zion, AME, CMEs, we all have that problem as well. And I know one of the things that we do is you do background checks, things of that nature. And now they require us to do those annually. And then fingerprints sometimes, depending on what other positions and stuff like that it might be. But yeah, I don't think it's just a one demographic or one type of thing. It's a universal thing that all churches, no matter what the denomination or even culture is, that's impacted by it.
Yeah, and I hope you hear, Victor, having been teaching in Nashville when a major incident like this affected the entire United Methodist Church. I mean, so I was aware when they had a circumstance at one of the Methodist camps that actually motivated the whole Safe Sanctuaries movement the Church adopted as a result of it. And I know at least a couple of other denominations who've had those kinds of instances that created national programs. And so, yeah, I just, like I said, I don't, it's at one level, it's understandable why it's difficult to maintain vigilance, but that doesn't absolve us from needing to maintain that vigilance. And background checks, one of the things we discovered was a lot of people who were in paid staff positions or places of authority often went through that. But for the church then to take the next level down to everyday workers and doing the kind of work, that was a new educational level So it's just it's that point of struggle, I think, that we all have at times. And what I found is when churches finally get into the rhythm of it, it's not that difficult, but once they fall out of rhythm, it's like a bicycle. When you can ride a bike, but you got to ride it. And if you're not pedaling, first time you get back on, it can be pretty dangerous from that standpoint. So
I brought that up. I brought that up because I ain't want. I know I'm not. I know I'm not a Nazarene, and I know that sometimes I can think that we only have problems in our own denominations, but or on certain things. It's actually just wanted to show, hey, you know what? This is not just a Nazarene thing. It's a cross barrier church thing, and so I know sometimes we can just be invested in our own thing and not realize that other church populations or church denominations go through the same things. We do. It might not be the same way, but we do.
yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a shared issue, and I'd even say not just in the United States, but I just think it's more definitely kind of woven into the nature of who we are as a people that creates part of the problem and the way we envision church. Anything else?
Yeah, my question is this. I know in some classes that I previously took, they if they have like a great paper,
Victor, you're Victor, we can't hear you. You're breaking up. Wait till the cell tower changes. I can wait on you. I can wait on you. Gotta move to the next cell tower. This is the negative side of trying to join from a moving vehicle. I've had this happen to me, so I can't complain. I think I know. Okay, Victor, try it again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering, do you have an example of a paper that was submitted in for this? Just for us to kind of see we can kind of model it, or just to get like some what a good paper look like for this to review. I'm only asking because I graduated in 2 weeks, and I'm just trying to make sure I get an A.
Let me look for one and post it. So I will try to look for a couple. I really want you to hear context is so different. So I always get nervous about putting out an example paper because that context may not match somebody else's context. And that is always, truthfully, that's gotten more people in trouble at times than when they try to make it more than what it needs to be. But I promise you, I will try to pull something up, a couple, not just one, but a couple of papers that may look somewhat different, but at least they would be examples, good examples. I promise not to put out a bad example for you to follow to assure that you don't get the grade, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, all right. All right, any other questions or concerns? No? All right. Well, I'm going to honor the fact that you were stuck without me for so long last time, and we'll call it an evening. I do want to say I have really appreciated, I think I've mentioned this every time, but a class with only 5 students just as tough. I know that, particularly in kind of generating conversations and interactions. But you guys have worked really hard at it, and I do appreciate it. I am not a big person to get in and try to drive online conversation. Figure you're stuck with me enough as it is through the readings. So I just have appreciated how you've encouraged each other along. And usually if I see something I can add, a book or those kinds of things, I'm more gifted at that than anything else. That's the kind of thing I like to do. I like to afflict you with my own proclivity to buy way too many books, for sure. Okay. And Dusty's going, thanks a lot. I've got a great spot for my library, right? My camper. Okay. Well, my prayers to you as we finish out the semester. You can reach out to me, and don't be shy. If you send me an email, if you do the inbox, it pops into my email. But if you're panicking in some way, text me. You've got my phone number as well. Reach out to me on my phone before you wait too long for me to respond. So I'm in at Nazarene Theological Seminary. We're in the last 2 weeks of the semester. And so we're already starting to grade major papers. We have commencement coming up soon. So I'll be scrambling a lot over the next couple of weeks anyways, but you've got my commitment to stay connected to you guys. Okay. All right. Well, have a good evening. Stay safe. All right. Victor, now you can take on, well, he's gone already. Take care. We'll see you. Blessings, Sean.